Ministries that are not trauma sensitive are not truly pastoral. They may be what people call apostolic, and they may be growing, and they may be full of ambition and pizzazz and great platforms, but ministries that are not fundamentally trauma shaped in the sense that they are caring for people in their wounds is not truly ministry.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. You know, there's a version of the Apostle Paul most of us have never met. This isn't the confident theologian or the architect of doctrine, but a man whose letter in 2 Corinthians shows someone writing in incomplete sentences, interrupting himself, defending himself while insisting he isn't. This is a man who is traumatized. And that's the provocation at the heart of today's conversation. Scot McKnight is back on the podcast, and we're joined by Adrienne Gibson, a mental health counselor whose master's thesis on trauma and the New Testament helped Scot see something he couldn't unsee. And together they've written Traumatized Church. And it's a book I think the church really needs at the moment. So we talk about what trauma actually is, what your body holds, and how it responds, often without you realizing it. We talk about what it looks like inside congregations, how pastors can unknowingly re-traumatize the people in their pews, and what it takes to build something that you could actually call a trauma-informed church. And we spend real time in 2 Corinthians asking what it means that one of the most foundational figures in Christian history may have been writing from a place of unprocessed pain. So join us as we walk through what it really means to be a healthy, trauma-informed space as the church. Here is my conversation with Scot McKnight and Adrienne Gibson. Well, Scot and Adrienne, welcome to Shifting Culture. So good, Scot, to have you back on, and Adrienne, it's so good to have you on for the first time.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Josh.
I'd love to just start at some of the premise of like reading 2 Corinthians through a trauma-informed lens and having Paul traumatized. It's an interesting reading. And so we don't really talk about that much. And it seems pretty new. Where did that first come in? Where did you start to see trauma inside that letter?
Here's how it starts. It starts with Adrienne's master's thesis on trauma and the New Testament, which had really good, sharp, and clear definitions of what trauma is. And I have to say, I probably used the word trauma at times, and I'd look through some literature, but I didn't have a clear enough image of what it meant for me to use it as a hermeneutical clue. So in reading her thesis, I came to a conclusion. I remember sitting upstairs in my back room, and Chris was in the living room. And I said, Chris, this thesis needs to be published. And she said, why? I said, because this explains what trauma is. You know, Chris is a psychologist. I think she would have said, we do know what trauma is. And so it became a part of my thinking. Then I wrote a little commentary on 2 Corinthians for the Everyday Bible Study. And as I was reading it, I have always paid attention to Paul's emotions in 2 Corinthians, especially in chapters 2 and chapter 7, where in 2, he's so frustrated he can't even minister when he has a great opportunity. In chapter 7, he is totally relieved because Titus shows up and tells him that the Corinthians like him, or they've responded positively. And I'm thinking, this is a Paul nobody knows. So I was writing on that, but as I got to chapters 10 through 13, it settled in my mind, this guy was traumatized. But I didn't do much with it. I said a few things, but it wasn't developed. And so at that point, Adrienne and I had a conversation probably before this. And I I kept in my mind that we're going to write a book together on trauma, and she didn't know that much about what I was going to do. So, what I did is I was asked by a publisher in England to write a booklet, and I said, I'd like to write it on Paul as traumatized. And they said, oh, we would like to have that. So I wrote it in a week or two, and it was like just under 20,000 words. So I talked to the editor for this set of booklets in England, and he said, oh, it can't be over 8,000 words. And I said, well, I can't reduce it to 8,000 words. There's too much stuff going on here. So at that point, I was in communication with Adrienne, but I said, I really have an angle where I can contribute to the project, and it's a matter of working these two things together. So it was as a result of Adrienne's thesis that I began to operate with a lens of trauma, that I was able to see Paul as traumatized. And then as I was working on it, I discovered a scholar by the last name of Clark, who had written, he was both a biblical scholar and a psychologist, who had written a book on Paul, or an article. It was very clearly defined that Paul had PTSD. So I found confirmation with a psychologist, biblical scholar, and I ran with it. And then Adrienne edited it and read it and said, I don't know anything about 2 Corinthians, but this is one way to look at the Apostle Paul.
As you started to read that, Adrienne, what stood out to you as far as Paul being traumatized? Where did you start to say, oh, as somebody who's been dealing with trauma for a long time and knowing what it looks like, what was standing out to you?
Well, first off, like when Scott unpacks that story, I think one of the things that I do want to point out is the thesis that I was writing was mostly about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed spaces. And so when you're trying to educate people on what that actually means and unpacking it, because it's becoming a very common thing that people say, but like, what does it actually mean? When Scott explains that story, the premise behind like what he went through is actually what I'm actually hoping more people will do when it comes to once someone shows you and breaks it down for you in ways that you can digest to understand trauma, then I hope you start realizing and seeing that it actually lives in a lot of people around you, or it's affecting or influencing a lot of people around you. And so the first aspect of becoming trauma informed and then creating trauma informed spaces or being more trauma sensitive is you actually have to first break down and understand trauma. And so that's why, like, when Scott explains that story, that's kind of what came to fruition when he was realizing, I started reading your thesis, which at first I didn't even know if he was going to approve the thesis, because the first section had nothing to do with New Testament or biblical studies. It was me writing, this is what I wish everyone knew about their bodies and how trauma is going to affect you. And so, yeah, Scott gave me the feedback of like, okay, but you've got to apply this now to the New Testament. But I'm thinking that's the stuff that has to be unpacked first in order to even understand that if we want to become more trauma informed, you have to get a basis understanding of how your body works and how trauma then kind of comes in and influences and affects you in those ways. And so Scott, this is kind of more of a question that he did. He started unpacking the ways in which he saw certain aspects of Paul's letter and the way he was engaging or the words that he was using or some of the decisions that he was making that were actually showing that Paul was stepping into fight, flight, or freeze or fawn in different ways. So I don't know, Scott, if you kind of wanted to get into a little bit. Scott's the one who kind of fleshed that out of, I'm actually now starting to see some of these different aspects of what we were writing about together that he was seeing in the life of Paul.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening and thank you for supporting the show. If you'd like to support the show and get early ad-free episodes, you go to Substack at shiftingculture.substack.com, and with your subscription, you could have a private podcast feed in your podcast app where you get to download early episodes before anybody gets to listen to them. You could also support the show by going to the support the show link at the bottom of the show notes in the app that you're using right now. That goes to a page that supports the work my wife and I do around the world. That donation is also tax deductible. So if you want a tax deductible donation, you could go there. Or if you want to support the show by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really helps new listeners find the show as well. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you so much for supporting this work so that we could see the body of Christ look more like Jesus.
When you read 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, and this is just one passage, you can actually look at the end of 1 Corinthians and see a bit of this. And in all of 2 Corinthians, there's stuff. But I focused on chapters 10 to 13 because it is unlike anything Paul ever wrote. All right, two terms that Adrienne uses are hyperarousal and hypoarousal. Hyperarousal is you got a lot of stuff is going on and your body's processing it. And it would involve you resist someone by fighting back, or you escape to find safety. So you flee.
Mm-hmm.
All right. 2 Corinthians. Paul even says, I'm not defending myself. When anybody says, I'm not defending myself, they know other people think they're defending themselves because Paul was defending himself. And I'm not calling him a liar. I'm just saying that he's probably just saying, I'm trying to cover myself here. I really don't want to be defending myself, but in some ways I am. And if you read the chapters, you'll say, yeah, he's fighting. He's fighting. All right. Hypoarousal is suppression. Is that fair to say? It's suppressing what's going on.
Yeah, they both agitate your body, but hypoarousal agitates you to where you just want to disappear and shut down. You're actually just trying to escape and hide.
So Paul, you could be stunned into doing nothing, or you can cave in to avoid pain. And one of the terms used for hypoarousal is fawning. Fawning is to cave into someone. And let's face it, lots of people who work with narcissists have to learn either cave in or go find another job, because that's the only way you can work with these kinds of people. All right. Paul did something unique in 2 Corinthians, and I think this is a characteristic of his theology, and that is he fawns. I call it gospel fawning, by saying, okay, I'd like to fight back, but I'm going to give in to you because that's the way Christ was. So there's that. I call it gospel fawning, and I think it's characteristic of some of the things that Paul does in 2 Corinthians. When he has a list of his sufferings, a long list, in which he's rubbing this list of suffering in the face of the Corinthians. The Corinthians are offended by Paul because Paul will not stand up and be the hero that Romans want men to be. So Paul says, you want me to brag about you want me to boast. He uses this word a lot, boasting. You want me to boast about my accomplishments? Okay, I've been shipwrecked. I've been beaten up. I've got scars. I've got bruises. I've got broken bones that haven't healed. He decides to brag about the wrong things, and that's fawning. It's sort of an intentional fawning. I don't know if it's hypoarousal, but he caves into their categories and flips it inside out and says, okay, I will brag about suffering. And that's just incomprehensible, probably, to the Corinthians, because they think this guy's crazy. He's bragging about all the wrong things. Well, those are some of the categories that I learned these from. I had seen them. I've never read Judith Herman's book. I've looked at it. I've looked up trauma and worked a little bit on it, just so I thought I was being intelligent. And I've read some things Adrienne put in her footnotes. But I think it was because of what she said that I thought, this is the first time I've ever thought of Paul fleeing from Corinth by staying home in Ephesus and sending Timothy or Titus to Corinth to do the dirty work, because he's afraid, in a sense. He knows how they're going to respond to him. And I find that to be a real insight about the Apostle Paul, and it's an indicator of trauma.
Yeah. And maybe not afraid, but maybe because of the trauma, he doesn't want to keep subjecting himself to the feelings that they bring about when he is in their presence.
See, that's why you need trauma therapists. That clarifies what's going on. I said afraid, and she says, no, that's not really what
I'm like, maybe not, no.
But I think that it can be an example and helpful for the way that we start to look at the people in the church, and not just the congregants, but also the pastoral leadership as well. And because there's trauma right now on both sides, and people throw that word around. What does it look like within the church? And you say there are quite a few people that have trauma stored in their body that then can be re-traumatized within the church. So, Adrienne, just walk us through what trauma looks like and what it is and what it feels like within the body, so that we could just get a foundation of what we're doing in the church.
Yeah, where I like to land, there's a lot of different definitions of trauma out there, but I do have to say most of the heavy hitters of trauma would say that's all very similar. It's an event or an experience that overwhelms your capacity to cope. And so a lot of times I think we think of trauma as just the event. So the definition, the event or an experience that overwhelms your capacity to cope. So trauma necessarily isn't the event in and of itself. It's how you perceive it and experience it, and then how it impacts you. So if you're in a situation or experience where you don't know how you're going to survive, or if you're going to survive, or what even survival will look like after I have to experience it, that becomes the situation that overwhelms your capacity to cope. And so many of us will experience trauma in our lifetime. I think that's the thing that comes to the understanding of, we keep thinking trauma is out there, or other people experience trauma. We get to stay away from it. The longer we're alive, the more years we get to have on this earth, the likelihood then of us getting to experience trauma or be with someone who's experiencing trauma, and it has such an effect on us because it's impacting us, that we can also then experience trauma. And so what I would like to say about it, though, is that event or an experience lives inside of you. You have memories and tiebacks, we call them triggers, that bring you back to that experience when you're around something or experiencing something similar. And so when we're wanting to know, when do we see trauma show up, or how do we know that we're like someone is experiencing trauma, it's usually in moments when their reaction or response doesn't seem to match or mirror your understanding of where you find yourself or what's going on. Because often what it ends up doing is it keeps us out of being able to build safe and secure relationships with others. So we're always doubting them or not trusting them. So then you think of the environment of church or ministry work, or, church is community. That's why we're going to see it constantly showing up in people, because deep down inside of themselves, they're attempting to want to engage, to want to be in this, to figure out how to do this life. And there's parts of their body that keep saying this is a threat to be in relationship with someone, or to listen to them in this way, or to trust them. And so what then you're experiencing is this kickback of like, you can't do this. So if you think of church and ministry, pastors, ministry leaders, volunteers, lay people, they're going to be experiencing this in themselves when they're working with people, or from the people they're working with, where they're just going, my response or reaction to being in this environment or with this people doesn't seem to really match what should be going on. It's not conducive. There's something that's happening that just makes it, it's cognitive dissonance. It's wrong.
And Joshua, I taught where Adrienne went to seminary at Northern, and I had a number of master's level courses, especially, where close to the majority, if not the majority, were women. And the dynamic of those classes was transformative for me in this way. The students didn't let certain things go. They would bring something, I'd say something, and they would, let's just say, now this never happened to me, but I know it's happened to others, talk about Paul's cruciform theology, which means suffering can be redemptive. Women who have suffered at the hands of men, of husbands, of
And who've been
other,
asked to.
yes,
They've
they,
been directed to.
that's right. They were responding in class. I'm not sure that this is proper kind of theology, that we're talking about redemptive suffering. Are you asking me to submit to these men in their life? Is John Piper right? It's okay for a woman to be abused if, however he said it. It was crazy, and it's been all over the internet so long. I don't know exactly what he said anymore. But and I remember other people in the Gospel Coalition circles and the Council for Biblical Womanhood and Manhood. That group of people has taught certain things that women who have suffered at the hands of men hear so differently,
Mm.
and that's the trauma in their body springing into hypoarousal and causing them to fight what is being said because they know it's not safe for them in that environment. And Joshua, in talking with Adrienne, and I've talked to Chris about this, my wife is a psychologist. I think pastors need to think of the percentage of their church that is traumatized, that these people have been traumatized. And what are the kinds of things that trigger? I don't know, you used a better expression just recently, Adrienne. What percentage of the people who are sitting there in our churches are in the trauma zone and saying certain things, telling certain stories, talking about certain scholars? I mean, in my life, I've brought up certain people and I've learned that those people are not safe for some women. So I don't bring those names up anymore. And I believe that true pastoral care is becoming aware of trauma sitting in those pews.
If I put myself into the shoe of a pastoral teaching team, maybe, and for some people, if they go, hey, we have to actually be aware of the trauma in the room and the triggers of what's going to happen. I think some people, if they don't have a grasp and a hold of what that actually looks like and means, is they're going to be scared to engage, to say something. They don't know if they're going to say something wrong. They're like, well, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. Like, I have to be so careful about what I say. How do we start the process of being more trauma informed, moving towards trauma healthy within the church, so that we can start to be comfortable with some of this language and what is actually happening in people's bodies?
I think it starts with trying to understand and really grasp trauma. And I know I say that, and I know it's a big ask though, because I live in the clinical world where we have to unpack and understand trauma. But I think it was my realization. I'm married to a pastor. He's been a pastor for 26 years. And I think when I would hear some of the stories or he would talk about what they're navigating, and I would think, I know that trauma is showing up in these stories. So there has to be a baseline understanding for non-clinical people to kind of grasp what this is, because I think people in the helping profession, pastors, ministry leaders, lay volunteers, I put them all in that helping category. They want to provide help. And so they need to kind of just have a basic, because I think when we get to understand what actually happens and takes place in your body when you experience trauma and how it just kind of lives there and kind of fleshes itself out day in and day out, that gives people a broader understanding of what it is then that they need to be aware of, like how they're presenting themselves, what they're saying. And I know it's a big ask, even with what you say. I'm like, that sounds exhausting. And I get that it can be defeating, but from a clinical point, like I stick my foot in my mouth all the time. And it's one of those where once you know better, you do better. I cannot always be aware of everybody's trauma or what I'm going to do or say that might bother them. Trauma informed care, though, means you're going to open your eyes to be more aware of it and to ask for feedback and be willing to take it. Because then when people share with me, Adrienne, this is what happened and this is what I felt when that happened. Now I'm more aware. One, I won't do that with that person, but I'm probably going to come across somebody else who's going to need me to respond in a similar manner. And so your awareness then of the things that you do need to watch out for or be aware of grow. And again, I as I say that, I know it can be overwhelming. It feels like it's this never ending thing of like, oh my gosh, I just have to be aware of so much. But it starts little and then it grows naturally and organically in the relationship that you have if you're talking about it, because then it makes you more insightful of there are things then that I don't need to say anymore. They serve no purpose and they actually can be more harmful than they're going to be helpful. Or I need to be the person now who asks more questions and makes a lot less assumptions. Because I think when we were breaking down the trauma-informed pillars, SAMHSA has 6 trauma-informed principles for companies. And we were like, what do churches, ministries, organizations then need to do with this? How would we transition this over to these types of organizations? The one that encompasses all 6, like it lays at the foundation of all of them, is listening, is actually listening. And so speaking less and asking more questions and listening to the response, because then we're going to get the feedback that we need. And then we just have to trust what the person says.
Give the 6 from SAMHSA, or
Well,
that
those
we
6,
developed.
yeah, the 6 that we don't, they're very similar. There's only a few that we use different terminology, but they do kind of mirror the 6 principles. The first one is safety. And it breaks down physical safety, like the physical space that you're meeting in, that you're working in, that you're talking with people about. There's a physical safety component to think through. But we also talk about emotional safety, and that's a bigger one. There's a lot more that we unpack with that, because if you want to be emotionally safe, you have to know inside of you what it feels like to be emotionally safe. Do you feel emotional safe? Because if you are feeling safe, then you actually know how to communicate that or look for that in other people. The second one is boundaries. Boundaries is always going to come up. In the helping profession, we need to know what our boundaries are, and we need to be able to communicate that with people. We need to listen to their boundaries. We need to let them set their own boundaries. We need to stay in our lane of what it is we're doing. What am I a professional in? What am I an expert in? What am I comfortable doing? What am I not? The third is trust and transparency. With trust, we need to discipline ourselves to be able to hold someone's trust. I think trust is a big one, because in church environments, ministry environments, we often will share something with someone else thinking that they can help us with this. But does the person who entrusted us know that we're sharing some of this very personal information about them? And in what regards do we do that? So trust and transparency is, do we have policies about this? Do the people who work in our ministries, do they feel trust? Because if we're all talking about each other, they got to know that we're talking about them too, even the people that work there. 4 is mutuality. Mutuality is bringing us back into right relationship with others. This is an important one, because when we have trauma, we heal in the context of community. It's really hard to heal from trauma on your own. So if we heal in the context of community, mutuality builds that ability to be in relationship with other people. And mutuality then tries to get people on equal playing field. Power differentials comes up when we're talking about boundaries. Mutuality tries to get them in relationship with people where there is no power differential. 5th is empowerment. Empowerment's about agency and autonomy. We want them to be able to speak up. We want to give them the space to be able to speak up, and we want to hear their voice. Trauma takes away voices. Trauma takes away power. Trauma takes away agency. Trauma takes away autonomy. If we're trying to build them back up and put this back together, we want to be able to empower them to take all of those things on themselves. And the 6th one is cultural awareness. This one is really about humility. We don't know everything that we need to know about people, about their culture, about the community that they're in, what their society and ethnicity looks like for them. So they get to be the experts in that, and we just get to keep learning. Those are the 6 pillars.
They're really helpful to get a grasp of what needs to be built. I know there's pockets of the church around the world that really love apostolic momentum, and they're just going to move quickly. They say, okay, this is going to slow us down. And so we don't need to do this work because the mission or whatever we're set here to do is more important than slowing us down. Like there's an urgency to it. if you have people in that situation, because I think that situation can like re-traumatize some people in a lot of different areas, is there a way to help the church see the different facets and aspects of what a healthy community looks like, that they're missing a piece of the pie? Yes, there's some great apostolic work we need to do, but there's also healthy community that needs to be held here. How can we start to maybe slow people down or recognize that there's a holistic nature to church and community, that this is a part of it that we need to be aware of and we need to implement?
Here's what comes to mind for me. First of all, I'm nervous about apostolic ministries because it sounds to me like people with a lot of ambition and don't get in my way or I'll bowl you over. I'm nervous about that kind of ministry. The reason I bring that up is because I think that what we could do is show people how Jesus himself ministered along with the 12. In the gospel passages, Jesus is interrupted and stopped for ministry all the time with people who are in the way. And the disciples are irritated because they've got ambition and they've got apostolic glory in their mind. And Jesus says, no, you just wait here. Yes, I can feed these people. And you should have seen this the time I did this before, but you haven't. So therefore, we're going to do this again. Is show Jesus is his interruptive ministries of talking with people, of listening to people, and allowing ministry to be shaped by the needs of people rather than ambition of the leaders. I think that's a fundamental category. And Jesus also, I just noticed this morning in the Gospels, he doesn't pray with others. The Gospels record Jesus going up into a mountain to be alone to pray. So in a sense, when he told the disciples to go into a closet, in Matthew chapter 6, when you pray, don't let everybody know what you're doing. Jesus embodied this with how he lived, but he withdrew for times of prayer and retreat and just communion with God. And I think that ministries that don't slow down like that, the way Jesus did, and we really don't know how often Paul slowed down, but he slowed down a lot because that man walked over 10,000 miles in his public ministry. And most of those miles were probably by foot, some by boat, of course. And during those times, he didn't have 200 people walking with him. He was with just a couple people. And he was pouring his life and a heart into them and hoping for some good news when he got to the next village, and going to the next village and finding out there was no news for him. So I would say this: ministries that are not trauma sensitive are not truly pastoral. They may be what people call apostolic, and they may be growing, and they may be full of ambition and pizzazz and great platforms, but ministries that are not fundamentally trauma shaped in the sense that they are caring for people in their wounds is not truly ministry.
I do have some thoughts, because as you were talking, I was thinking this through and I thought, okay, from a standpoint of let's just look at relationship. So let's take it out of ministry context, just any type of relationship. If you're building a relationship with another person, the more intense and rapid escalation that is experienced at the beginning of a relationship, do you know it's a red flag for the more intensity of that crash and burn at the end? Because what you're building is you're building passion and idealization. You're not actually building intimacy and connection. You're building this deep desire and drive to be involved in something and to be connected with someone and to try to join them on that page of intensity. But you're not actually building true intimacy. And so, because if you think about it, intimacy in a relationship of connection takes time. It just takes growth. And so when we're looking at toxic relationships, they often start really hot and heavy and passionate. We call it love bombing. We call it idolization. I want to convince you that I know something and it's going on and it's so intense and wonderful. I'm trying to get you to join me. And if you join, it's about the passion and the excitement and the intensity. And those relationships, when they burn out with that same type of intensity because the intimacy wasn't really part of it. And so I would say the slower a relationship grows in any type of form, there's room for safety, there's room for trust, there's room for transparency. Both people get to feel safe. Might someone want it to go faster? Yeah, maybe, but you have to kind of relationships always involve two people, so you have to go at the pace where both people feel comfortable. So if we're building a ministry relationship, but it is about the intensity and the passion and the drive, and I've got this ministry commitment that I've got to go, we're not taking into account the other side of that relationship, which is the person. There's another person involved.
That's good. There's a book, I cannot actually pronounce her last name. The title of the book is It's Not About You. It's about relationships with people, not with narcissistic personality disorder, but people with a narcissistic personality type. And what it's like to work with them. And that very point that Adrienne made right there is very important to, her name is like Rishmaturi or something. It's about the beginnings of this relationship and how intense it is. I don't know if she describes it quite the same way, but it was exactly what Adrienne was saying. And churches that form that way, church relationships that form way, are probably destined for the same kind of blow up in relationship, because true relationships take time to form and they are paced by mutuality rather than dominance.
If we are setting up a community, maybe from the beginning, it feels like we could start to implement some of these things. We can be trauma informed. We could start to see trauma in people. Sometimes when we have all the dysfunctions that have been latent in a church community for years, it's hard to get into this track and to see it. If we have people in situations where, hey, it's been a passionate community, or it's been something where there's been a lot of love bombing or whatever it is that they're doing, there may be a narcissistic leader. How do we start to help people within those communities that, I don't know, maybe some people don't want to maybe go the routes of being cognizant of trauma in the congregation?
Well, okay. This touches on the Tove book and touches on Pivot book and also touches on this trauma book. And that is, these are the wrong people involved in ministry leadership. This is important to me. It's beyond important to Adrienne. She's devoted her life to this, is that these are not healthy enough people to be leading churches. It's going to flame out, or it's going to cause all kinds of ruptures. Is that you can't form a healthy church with an unhealthy pastor. And what I mean, all pastors are a little bit unhealthy. All people are a little bit unhealthy. So, but it was the work on Tove and Pivot that persuaded me of this. Our churches are shaped in the evangelical world by platforms on Sunday morning. And there are certain kinds of personalities that do well on platforms in front of people. Now, listen to all these P's. And they like to preach and prophesy from those platforms. And it allows them to become celebrities, and they become personas rather than people who are spiritually formed. And all of that then starts to create a culture for churches. This is unhealthy. And I don't believe it starts with seminaries. I believe it starts with idolization and role models of people who are seen as great pastors. What they are almost always are amazing platform performers. That is not the same thing as a pastor. What is a pastor? A pastor is someone who nurtures Christ-likeness in other people and himself or herself. And a culture shaped by that is different than a culture shaped by a platform with a persona performing prophetic and preaching tasks behind the pulpit that brings in plenty of money.
Amen. What a great alliterative answer. So
I
good.
actually said these things one day to someone who wrote a book about this and used my language. And I thought, well, I should have at least been given credit, but it was just spun out all of a sudden. I just started using these P's and I thought, these are pretty good. I'll have to remember these.
That's great. So, Adrienne, I want you to really just help us. If trauma is stored in our body, we feel it in our body. We can have triggers, be re-traumatized. What does a healthy community, trauma-informed community, start to look like when we realize that people are going to be re-traumatized and there are triggers? How do we start to form healthy communities that deal with this on an ongoing basis in real relationships?
This is the question. Thank you. One of the things that Scott and I talked a lot about when we were writing the end of the book, when we were discussing the 6 pillars and whatnot, one of the points we wanted to make and we wanted to keep coming back to was this is a top-down approach. We're not asking people to read this or become more aware of trauma and the 6 pillars and what that looks like to unpack in a ministry, and then to just start implementing it with their congregation. It's actually a top-down approach of when a church or a ministry starts implementing this in themselves and utilizing it among their own staff, it's going to have that trickle-down effect that it's going to start just pouring over into everyone's lives. If you think about it, this is actually how just the gospel message works. We wouldn't, when we're in ministry or when we're pastoring, we're not on stage or up front or leading a discussion asking people to do something that we ourselves are not doing. And if we are, our hope then is that someone would look at us and go like, I don't see you doing that. I don't see you living your life that way. I don't see you practicing that. And so becoming trauma informed actually starts with the people in the helping profession who are providing the help. And they have to start by taking care of themselves and then learning what it looks like to take care of each other, because they're all doing this together. They're all in this work together. So if you think about that, though, if I work in a ministry environment where I now know we're all kind of learning this and unpacking this together, and we have that safe place, my work environment or my volunteer environment is going to start feeling safer. So I'm going to start stepping into what safety feels like. And I'm going to start building trust with the people I work with and work alongside. So they're learning to trust me. I'm learning to trust them. Boundaries are being reestablished and rediscussed along the people. So I'm implementing boundaries. I'm learning how to use boundary language with people. Once all of that's taking place with that group, those people, it's going to have the trickle down effect where this will start to then affect everyone that comes to be ministered to or to serve with them as well. Because if you think about it, like lay volunteers who show up, the environment starts feeling different and they realize I serve in a place that just feels really safe. And there's a lot of mutuality and there's a lot of relationship and community taking place. It has to start with people wanting to be in the helping profession ministry-wise who are doing it amongst themselves and learning to live life this way. And that overflow and outpouring will actually just start to affect the people who are showing up.
And I would add, from the pivot project that I did with my daughter, sometimes the leadership circle will not do this because the leader is not one who is safe and doesn't care if it's safe because he's getting all the platform persona, performance, etc. Okay. But there can be what we call pockets of tove, another P. There can be pockets of safety where you can create, let's say in a small group or a group of friends in a church, that is a genuinely safe place that is trauma informed, trauma safe, and it is also trauma healing. because the heart is being transformed. The bodies are beginning to feel what God designed them to feel. So I think that the best form is when the leaders embrace a trauma-informed space and a trauma-safe space and trauma healing spaces. We believe that, but sometimes there are people in a church who realize that they'll never achieve that with that group of leaders, so they begin to create their own safe spaces. This is like the house churches of the first century. It doesn't have to be 4,000 people who are all trauma safe. If you feel as a Christian safe with a group of people, it's one of the best things that there is. Like my wife and I feel really safe with our small group of 8 people. And we really like these people. Those are the kind of pockets of safety, pockets of trauma informed spaces that churches can create. But I really like what Adrienne said. It's not simply, you can't just do this top down. You can't say, you got to do this. It's got to be, this is the kind of teaching and spiritual formation that is fundamentally perceived in the body as living the gospel, as living Christianity rather than just informed Christianity.
Adrienne, there's some people, I think, when they think of trauma, I know that, like, I lived in the Middle East for 5 years, and I worked with war refugees, and so we wanted to do discipleship and all sorts of things with war refugees, but we had to first figure out this trauma thing, because it was very acute, and it was massive in scale. When we first went, we didn't think that trauma was there. Like, we just didn't think about the trauma. We just thought about, hey, let's disciple and share Jesus and all those things. Trauma, if people think it's just like through war or major massive events, then people are going to minimize what they're feeling in their body and not start to heal. How could people recognize that there is trauma stored in our body? And then what are some first steps to get some healing so that relationships can start to be healthier?
The most awareness I would want to raise is we are meant to live in regulated bodies. And that's kind of what needs to be understood, is that there's a difference between regulation and dysregulation. Now, when we get dysregulated, nothing has gone wrong. We have not messed up. Our body isn't working against us. It hasn't deceived us. We're meant to be regulated, to go to dysregulation, to go back to regulation. And so the ways I like to explain this to people is when we're not hungry, we're in regulated bodies. All of a sudden, we're like, I am starving. Our bodies become dysregulated. They let us know there's something not balanced in here that you need to pay attention to and you need to take care of. And so what do? We find food. I can either find it now, I can find it later, and we go back to being regulated. That is regulation, dysregulation, regulation. That's exactly what takes place in our bodies, though, with our emotions. When we experience trauma, then we become dysregulated, and it's that memory of dysregulation that lives within us. So to be aware that I might have had trauma, or I might have experienced trauma and it keeps coming up, is to go, I have to know what I feel like when I'm regulated, and I have to know what I feel like when I'm emotionally dysregulated. You got to pay attention to the clues and signals that your body is giving you. And if you're getting emotionally dysregulated about things that don't really seem to make sense, I'm always uncomfortable in this environment. I'm always uncomfortable when he's speaking. I want to crawl out of my skin every time this music comes on. Your body's letting you know it is dysregulated. There's something going on. And people who need to then realize they need healing or they need to work on this is they're struggling to get back to that regulation. And this is the tool and trick that counselors are often teaching people, is to go, okay, once you realize you're dysregulated, let's just practice how to bring your body back into regulation. People who have experienced trauma are going to have a harder time getting regulated. It's just going to be a harder piece of work because they don't really know what's going on. So that's why so that question of like, how do people become aware that they might have experienced trauma? You're right. If you've been in military combat, if you've worked overseas, if you've been in war, most people are like, okay, I'll probably have trauma and I've got to work on it. But it's the other things day in and day out where they realize, I don't know if that's trauma, or I don't. it's the more subtle things that are going on that when we just then need to learn to pay attention to our bodies to then know it's trying to give you the clues and signals that something took place and you are still bothered by it.
Scott, what is like a major takeaway from Paul in 2 Corinthians that would then help the church in this trauma-informed area?
Now, this is interesting because I don't think many people perceive Paul this way. I think if you are open-minded about the Apostle Paul and not convinced that the man is perfect, and just because it's scripture doesn't mean everything that Paul says about himself is the way everybody should be. Paul is transparent for 4 chapters in this book in ways that you will never find anywhere else in the Bible other than the book of Psalms. Maybe Jeremiah. Jeremiah's a weeping prophet. Okay, but there's nothing like this in the Bible where Paul is just opening up his heart. He actually says to the Corinthians, would you please open your hearts up to me? Now, that's extremely vulnerable. Now, Paul has done this in these 4 chapters. He's just opened up his heart, and it's not pretty all the time. If you read Greek, which I assume most people don't, you can sympathize at least with someone like Tom Wright, who says the grammar of 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 is choppy. This is a guy who's writing incomplete sentences or incomplete thoughts, and he's interrupting himself and clarifying himself. It's not good English. It's not good Greek, but it is very transparent. So I think a takeaway from me has been Paul can be a really good role model for pastors revealing their heart to their therapists. Now, I would say this. Adrienne probably even heard me say this in class. Maybe I didn't in her classes. If you are a pastor and you talk like this to your congregation, you're going to lose your job. But if you talk like this to your therapist, you're going to gain your heart. And I think that's one of the real takeaways for me about 2 Corinthians. This is a Paul who is rarely known.
This has been fantastic. Just before you guys go, I'd love a recommendation or 2 from you guys. So anything you've been reading or watching lately, you could recommend.
I watch baseball games. I've been reading lately about the Holocaust and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So my topics are not very pleasant, but I'm reading a book right now called Complicity in the Holocaust by a guy named Robert P. Erickson, and how the church defended the Jews, the confessing church with Bonhoeffer. They were on the side of the Jews who were baptized Christians or ministers, but not almost never for Jews because they were Jews. Now, Bonhoeffer's family was a little different in this regard, but by and large, the hero for the evangelical world, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the confessing church, failed miserably in perceiving what Hitler was doing to Jews as Jews, rather than the confessing church was always in favor of Jewish Christians to be treated as part of the church. But they did not go the next step and defend Jews. And that's a major failure. So there you go. Not a very pleasant topic, but it's good for us to see what's going on in our political situation.
Yes, very much so. Adrienne?
Oh, so I am trying to get through a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Bruce Perry. It's one of those books where you read a chapter and then you probably just need to put it down. It is about childhood trauma. He's an MD. I think he has a medical degree in neuroscience because he talks a lot about how certain environments and situations change the development of our brains when we're children. And he is a very smart man. So it's a hard read. That's a hard read.
All right, two really hard reads for people, but also really good. Well, the Traumatized Church is available April 21st, so just right around the corner from our recording.
Next week.
Anywhere books are sold. It's a fantastic book. I think really important for the church. And I think it's really important for us to start to implement some of these practices, these things to say we can be trauma-informed or be healthy within our churches, so we know what is going on. We know what is going to trigger people, and how do we create safe environments, and so that we could create some mutuality and empowerment, and we can move people forward as community, that we could be a healthy community that starts to embody the ways of Christ, that looks more like Jesus. So I think part of that is being trauma informed and starting to heal those things within our communities. So this is a fantastic book. Is there anywhere that you'd like to point people to connect with either of you and what you're doing?
Yeah, I am a mental health counselor in Arizona. I do need to clarify what that means is I'm only licensed to practice with individuals who are in Arizona. But I own a small private practice called Ballard Counseling. And so there is a website for that is how people can reach out and contact me if need be.
I have a Substack, Scot McKnight Substack, and I can be reached that way.
Perfect. All right.
Okay.
Well, Scott and Adrienne, thank you so much for this
Good
conversation.
to see you again, Joshua.
It was
Thank
really good
you.
to be with you today.
Thanks, Adrienne. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out, share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.